Hello and welcome to Byjus Exam Prep. Welcome to the Hindu analysis. Before we begin, I would like to remind you that as part of our All India Prelims test series for 2023, the second free mock test on polity shall be held this Sunday on the 13th of November at 9:30 am. The test shall be available both in English and Hindi and will be available both in online and offline format. So all serious aspirants for the 2023 prelims, immediately register yourself for the free mock test by using the link provided in the description box below. And also don't forget to join our Telegram channel for further updates on current affairs. So with this, let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at an article from page number 10 of the Delhi edition of The Hindu. This column, written by Priyanjali Malik, examines the contribution of Indian Army during the World Wars and how their contribution has been largely neglected and forgotten in post-independent India. The Hindu has brought out this important article on the 11th of November because today marks the Armistice Day, also referred to as Veterans Day or Remembrance Day in few countries, that commemorates the day on which the First World War was formally brought to an end. On the 11th of November in 1918, hostilities on the Western Front, that is in Western Europe, was brought to an end with the signing of the Armistice Agreement. The agreement was signed in France between the Allied powers that included UK, France, Italy, US, Russia and much of the Western powers, which collectively had defeated the Central powers led by Germany, Ottoman Turkey and the Austria-Hungary Empire. So Central powers conceded defeat and would go on to formally accept the end of the war by signing the Armistice Agreement with the Allied powers. So on this historic day around the world, the sacrifice of millions of soldiers who lost their lives or who were gravely injured is marked and remembered. But this historic day hardly finds a mention in India. Apart from small ceremonies in army cantonments, the event is hardly marked by the government or by the people, even though India cumulatively lost more than 160,000 soldiers in World War I and World War II. So it's in this context that we need to examine the role of the Indian Army in the First World War and as well as in the Second World War, as the topic can be very important under GS Paper 1 for world history. It's highly unfortunate that the role and contributions of the Indian Army has not been so well documented or taught or celebrated, despite the immense sacrifices that Indian soldiers had to make during the world wars. During the First World War, Indian Army fought on behalf of the British and contributed a large number of soldiers who saw conflict in different theatres, including in Europe, in West Asia and the Mediterranean region, and as well as in parts of Africa and Southeast Asia. Soldiers of the Indian Army fought legendary battles against the German Empire and its allies, especially in East Africa, stretching all the way from Tanzania to Somalia, and also on the Western Front in Western Europe, particularly in France. In total, during First World War, more than 13 lakh Indian soldiers served the British, and they were deployed in various conflict zones, including France, Belgium, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Gallipoli, Palestine, Sinai Desert, etc. By the end of the war, a total of 74,000 plus Indians had lost their lives, and nearly 70,000 Indians returned home with serious injuries. This brutal war, which was mainly fought in the trenches, saw very active participation from the Indian soldiers, who gallantly fought on behalf of the Allied powers, and their immense contribution was even recognized by the British Commander-in-Chief of the Indian Army, Sir Claude. He had once remarked that Britain couldn't have come through the wars if they hadn't had the Indian Army. This was a statement made by Sir Claude after the Second World War, highlighting the overall contribution of the Indian soldiers in both the world wars. In World War I alone, a total of 11 Victoria Cross medals were awarded to Indian soldiers, which was the highest gallantry award awarded by Britain. Indian soldiers fought side by side with their European counterparts, and even today there are a number of memorials across Europe, Africa and West Asia to honor the supreme sacrifices made by Indian soldiers. The same story would repeat during Second World War as well. During the Second World War, India contributed an army of more than 2.5 million soldiers to assist in the war efforts of the Allied powers against Axis powers led by fascist Germany. As fascism and imperialism of Germany, Italy, and Japan was posing a global threat, India would proactively contribute millions of soldiers to the war efforts of the Allied powers, even as India was preoccupied fighting for independence against the colonial power. During the Second World War as well, Indian soldiers would see action across different conflict zones, and more than 87,000 Indian soldiers lost their lives. And even today, you find war cemeteries and memorials to be present in different parts of the world that pay tribute to the sacrifices of the Indian soldiers. In the Second World War, Indian soldiers won a total of 31 Victoria Cross medals that accounted for 15% of the total Victoria Crosses that were awarded by the British. It's a well established fact by historians that without Indian soldiers and without contributions from India that included non combatants, laborers, doctors, material, money, and resources, the course of both the world wars would have been entirely different. And in fact, this Indian contribution during the war efforts were so significant that even today in some countries, tributes are paid to the sacrifices of Indian soldiers, and you still find memorials to be present across Europe, Africa, and West Asia, and even in Southeast Asia. Take, for example, the war memorial at Haifa in Israel, where Indian soldiers from Mysore, Jodhpur, and Hyderabad fought a legendary battle against the Ottoman forces and the German forces and defended Haifa bravely. There is a memorial even in Haifa today marking the contribution of Indian soldiers. Across Europe, in France, in Britain, in Belgium, and also in parts of Africa, there are memorials paying tributes to Indian soldiers and the sacrifices they made during world wars. But it is highly unfortunate that within India, the efforts and contributions of Indian soldiers is still not recognized and celebrated. And this lack of recognition and acknowledgement stems from two reasons. The first reason is that in India there has always been a general feeling, pre-independence and even post-independence, that India shouldn't have assisted the British in the war efforts, as India was being subjugated by the colonial power, and parallelly India was fighting for its independence from Britain. The second reason is that there was always a grievance in India that India wasn't getting anything in return, despite all the contributions it was making to the war efforts, because the British had made a lot of promises to India in return for the assistance extended during the war period. During the First World War, India's freedom fighters, including Mahatma Gandhi and other top leaders, would extend support to the Allied powers in the war efforts, and the same support was extended during the Second World War as well. In return, Britain had promised greater autonomy, but the colonial government would go on to betray its promises and also caused a lot of bitterness within India's freedom movement when Viceroy Lord Lilithgow openly declared India's support to the war efforts without even consulting the Indian leaders. Then later, when Indian freedom fighter Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose tried to align with the Axis powers in order to seek support from Nazi Germany in the hope of overthrowing the British from India, the British would use this as a propaganda strategy to pit Indians against Indians. And as a result of these reasons, a general feeling persisted in India that India's independence got delayed somehow due to India's role in the World War and its contribution in the World War. But the writer of the column clearly explains that this happens to be a wrong assumption because neither India's participation in the World War delayed its independence, and nor was it about protecting British interests, because this was an ideological war against fascism, which threatened not just European interests and British interests, but was a major threat to the modern civilized world itself. And moreover, the war had reached Indian soil, especially during Second World War, and hence it was about protecting Indian territory as well. According to the writer, the prevailing impression that these wars were outside wars for India, fought somewhere else for somebody else, is a wrong presumption, because these were wars that mattered to India as well, not just ideologically, but also with regard to protecting and defending Indian territory. Because during the Second World War, If you look at the conflict in the eastern parts, Indian territory itself was threatened by Japanese forces which had made rapid advances in Southeast Asia, and they had come as close as Myanmar, and fighting had extended to today's Manipur and Nagaland as well. Even in this theatre of conflict, Indian soldiers fought a legendary battle against the Japanese forces, who were known for their atrocities and brutality, and managed to hold back the Japanese invasion, thus protecting not just Indian territory, but also symbolizing India's stand against fascism. So it's in this context that today we need to remember and recognize the contribution of our soldiers during the World War, as the course of the conflict during both the World Wars could have been entirely different without the Indian contribution. Today, if you look at the National War Memorial, which has come up in New Delhi, it has been largely dedicated to soldiers who lost their lives post-independence. So from the side of the government, the civil society, the people in general, there is a lack of recognition of the Indian contribution during the World Wars. And hence the writer is of the opinion that it is high time we recognize this contribution and even celebrate the immense sacrifices made by Indian soldiers during both the World Wars. Now let's take up an article from page number 12, which refers to an important development in the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict. Recently, Russia has announced the withdrawal of its troops from the strategic Kherson region of Ukraine, which until recently was under Russian control. And as this appears to be a major turning point in the conflict, it's important to examine the significance of this development and understand the reasons behind the Russian retreat. We should also talk about what this could mean for the future of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. See, reportedly, Russia has been withdrawing troops from the Kherson region, which has even been confirmed by Ukrainian and Western intelligence. And this marks a major retreat from Russia, as this was the only regional capital that Russian forces had occupied fully since the start of the war. And it could be an indication of the major reverses that Russia has suffered in the conflict in the last few months. So the Kherson region located over here in southern Ukraine is a strategically vital region, as it serves as a land bridge connecting the Crimean Peninsula over here, which Russia had annexed in 2014 and had even built strategic bridges which were recently attacked that could connect the Russian mainland with the front lines of the conflict in Zaporozhye, Donetsk and Luhansk. When the war started in February 2022, Russian forces quickly moved from Crimea and also from eastern Ukraine with the support of Russia-backed separatists, and quickly gained control over Kherson, which is a major regional capital in southern Ukraine. This allowed Russian forces to create a land bridge between Russian-occupied Crimea and Russian-dominated Donetsk and Luhansk regions in the east. It allowed Russian forces to quickly move over quick cities like Mariupol and gain control of trade and ship movement all across the Sea of Azov. So with this, Russia established a new front line in the war, occupying large parts of Ukrainian territory, and mounted large-scale attacks across the Dnipro River, which had clearly pushed Ukraine on the back foot. So the Kherson region has been critical for Russia since the start of the war to keep sending troops and supplies across from Crimea towards the eastern parts of Ukraine that Russia controlled. And it not only allowed Russia to take the battle deep into Ukraine, but would also allow Russia to control the strategic Black Sea. The Kherson region has been vital for Ukraine as well, as it gives access to the Odessa port and other key ports facing the Black Sea, which have been vital for continuing food grain shipments to the Black Sea. Also, Kherson region is critical for agriculture, as there are many important irrigation channels that are sourced from the Dnipro River, and Russia and Ukraine have been fighting over the control of these irrigation channels as well. So in the early days of the war itself, Russia gained quick control over the Kherson region. But now, as Russia faces a strong pushback from Ukraine, Russia has decided to retreat from the region, thereby marking a significant shift in this conflict. Earlier, Russia had retreated from its assault against capital Kiev and had also retreated from the Kharkiv region in the east of Ukraine. Now, this would mark the third major retreat of Russian forces and also a major battlefield defeat for Russia. According to strategic experts, there are three reasons why Russia is making a retreat from Kherson. The first reason, of course, is the failed mobilization plan of Russia. The initial mobilization of troops that Russia carried out in February 2022 hasn't been sufficient for Russia to keep control over these areas, and even the recent partial mobilization ordered by Putin has not brought in the required forces, weapons, and resources needed to continue this conflict and to retain Russia's edge in controlling or occupying the eastern and southern parts of Ukraine. The second reason is that Russia has found it difficult to govern and keep these areas under control, despite the imposition of martial law in these occupied areas. From the local population, there has been stiff resistance, including guerrilla attacks and covert wars involving Ukrainian intelligence, and have managed to strike at key Russian targets, thus pushing Russia to retreat. So this increasing Ukrainian counteroffensive happens to be the third major reason which is pushing Russia back and forcing Russia to retreat from the strategically vital Kherson region. Over the last 8 months, Ukraine has received supplies of modern weaponry and long-range weapons from US, UK, Germany and even France, which has allowed Ukraine to step up its counterattacks and strengthen and fortify its positions along the front lines. Russian forces across the Dnipro River have come under tremendous pressure, and with Russia facing a major resource constraint and with winter season all set to set in, Russia has been forced to retreat from Kherson. That marks a major battlefield victory for Ukraine. But it might still be too early to predict the future course of the war, as Russia would now try to focus more on the eastern parts, that is Donetsk and Luhansk. And some experts even predict that this could be a Russian deception tactic to make the Ukrainians overconfident and to invite them into an ambush in Kherson, where Russian forces could mount a surprise attack on Ukrainians when they come to take control of Kherson back. But if Ukraine were to make inroads into Kherson and regain control, then it would be a major defeat for Russia, because from Kherson it would be easier for Ukrainian troops to target Crimea as well, which happens to be a major military base for Russia. And the loss of this land bridge could cripple Russian war efforts. And that's the reason why this development happens to be a turning point in the conflict. Now coming to the next topic, let's take up an editorial from page number 10 that refers to the new public service broadcast guidelines that were recently notified by the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. See, earlier this week, the Union Cabinet approved the new guidelines for uplinking and downlinking of television channels in India. These new rules replace the older rules of 2011, and it seeks to simplify the regulation of television and satellite TV sector, along with increasing compliance from TV channels with regard to the new guidelines that have been notified by the government. The Ministry of I&B has pointed out that the new guidelines will ease compliance for TV channels and simplifies regulation of the sector, because TV channels will no longer be required to seek permission for live telecast of events. They also need not seek prior permission for change of language or even to convert the mode of transmission from SD to HD. So these simplified rules will enable ease of doing business in the satellite TV segment and further relaxes the strict regulatory compliance requirements. These rules are intended to simplify and rationalize the previous rules and thus enable India to emerge as a teleport hub to transform India into a hub of media networks. The new rules will even allow Indian teleports, that is India registered satellite TV networks, to uplink foreign channels as well. But amongst these guidelines, the most important provision is related to a new obligation on TV channels to telecast content which is in the larger interest of the nation and the public for at least 30 minutes for every day of the week on various themes that have been identified by the government. So the editorial here specifically evaluates this provision of the new guidelines and points out that this obligation to telecast content which is in national or public interest is a welcome move by the government, because at the end of the day, airwaves and broadcast frequencies are public property that should be serving a larger interest for the society and the public. So any company or teleport which is registered in India and operating in India, except for the foreign channels, will be henceforth obliged to air 30 minutes of content in the larger interest of the nation and the public to spread more awareness on certain specific themes such as education, spread of literacy, agriculture and rural development, promoting issues related to health and family welfare, promoting awareness related to science and technology, welfare of women, promoting weaker sections in the society, protection of environment and cultural heritage, and also to promote national unity and integration. The editorial is of the opinion that such content on these identified themes is much needed in the Indian society to spread awareness in key areas as our country and society is affected by a variety of social issues. Such awareness programs could help solve many social problems and challenges that we face in sectors such as education, healthcare, rural development, women empowerment, protection of weaker sections, etc. However, the only concern pointed out by the editorial is that the government hasn't specified the modalities of implementing this guideline. The government has given to itself the power to issue advisories time to time regarding the airing of this content, which might be seen as controversial as this could allow the government to control the content on TV channels. So there is need for some clarity in this regard, because as of now the guidelines are providing the channels the flexibility to decide on the content that they will air in this 30-minute slot. But the powers the government has given to itself regarding the advisories it can give on the content is of concern, and the government needs to clarify this position. The government also should clarify as to how the TV channels can recover the lost revenue, as this 30-minute segment may not be very attractive for advertisers and sponsors. But apart from these concerns, the editorial points out that public service broadcast is a good idea in a diverse country like India in order to tackle several social issues. Now let's look at an article from page number 11 which tries to answer a very important constitutional question. Should chief ministers have a say in the appointment of governors? This question comes up in the backdrop of various controversies in states such as Kerala, Tamil Nadu and Maharashtra involving the governor of the state and the chief minister and the government of the respective state. See, historically, if you look at the role of the governor, its origin traces back to the days of the Mughal era and the British Empire, where the governor's office was always meant to exercise the control and interference of the center at the provincial level. Essentially, the governor was an agent of the center. But post-independence, the constitutional position of the governor underwent a change, where the governor was expected to carry out several vital political and administrative and constitutional functions. As you're aware, the governor plays a role in deciding upon the formation of a government after state elections. The governor also addresses the joint session of the assembly after elections and also the budget session, and plays a key role in lawmaking by signing the bills that have been passed by the assembly. In few states, the governor even has few special powers related to administration of scheduled areas, and also enjoys a few discretionary administrative and constitutional powers. The governor has an overall responsibility to ensure that the state's administration is being carried on in line and in accordance with constitutional provisions, and even report to the center if there is any deviation, which could even lead to the invocation of emergency powers that results in the imposition of president's rule in the state. So these extraordinary powers enjoyed by the office of the governor has often been controversial, because it has been noted that the ruling party at the center often tends to misuse the office of the governor to topple state governments and to interfere with the functioning of states that are especially ruled by the opposition parties. This is where a question arises whether the chief minister of a state should have a role in the appointment of the governor. Currently, under the Indian Constitution, we have Article 155, according to which the President of India appoints the governor. This, of course, is not a discretionary power of the President, but the President is bound by the aid and advice of the Union Council of Ministers. So essentially, the central government has complete authority to decide upon the appointment of governor, which eventually is carried out in the name of the President. But several commissions, including the Second Administrative Reforms Commission, the first Administrative Reforms Commission, the Sarkaria Commission, and even the Raj Mannar Committee appointed by the Tamil Nadu government have all observed that this manner of appointment of the governor has a deep impact on the nature of center-state relations. While legal and constitutional experts argue that the office of the governor is relevant in a federal structure to maintain a link between the center and the state, it has been parallelly pointed out by these commissions that the office of the governor shouldn't become a tool for misuse, as that would violate the very federal structure of the constitution and lead to a breakdown of center-state relations. So most of these commissions and several experts and even the Supreme Court in the landmark Bommaya case have all argued for a role of the Chief Minister in the appointment of the governor, if not for a decisive role, at least for a consultative role. The suggestion by various commissions has been that the appointment of governor should happen through a central committee that could involve the Prime Minister, the Home Minister, and the leader of the opposition in the Lok Sabha, who will consult with the Chief Minister of the respective state while appointing the governor in order to ensure smooth functioning between center and state and also between the Chief Minister and the Governor of the state. This model of appointment was recommended by the National Commission to review the working of the Constitution, and many experts have supported this move to take away the sole power of the center in appointing the governor and distributing this power to a committee which would involve the leader of opposition from the Lok Sabha, along with making it mandatory for the committee to consult with the respective chief ministers so as to build a cordial relationship between the governor and the CM and also between the center and the state without the possibility of misusing the powers that have been vested with the governor. Now, coming to the last article of the day, we have an important update from the 27th Conference of Parties to the United Nations Climate Change Convention, which is currently underway at Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. At the ongoing climate change negotiations, India has brought up an important issue by insisting that developed countries should do more with regard to providing climate finance to developing and underdeveloped nations. Because back in 2009, during the Copenhagen summit, developed countries had committed climate finance of $100 billion every year to developing and underdeveloped countries. This was to take into account the historical emissions and historical responsibilities of the developed countries, which has largely contributed for global warming and climate change. But this promised financial commitment has never been fulfilled by the developed countries. And India has also clearly pointed out that a meager sum of $100 billion is nowhere sufficient to address the challenges being posed by global warming and climate change. India has cited the findings of the latest IPCC report, which points towards increased risk for developing and underdeveloped nations as a result of climate change. And India has given a call for enhanced funding from these countries, at least in the range of a few $1 trillion. This push for enhanced funding from developed countries, which is coming from developing nations led by India, is being officially referred to as NCQG, or the New Collective Quantified Goal on Climate Finance. This would essentially become the new climate finance target if it is accepted by the developed world and is expected to be fulfilled by the developed countries by 2024. Now let's take a look at a couple of mains practice questions. The first question: examine the contribution of Indian soldiers during the world wars. The second question: in the context of Russia-Ukraine conflict, evaluate the reasons for Russia's retreat from the strategic Kherson region. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the answer writing portal, for which the link has been given in the description box below. So with this, we bring our discussion to an end, and if you like the initiative, do support us by pressing the like button, share your comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.